Children, you can see in this picture James Herriot, the veterinary doctor, as well as the narrator of our story, has stopped his car and talking to Mrs. Pumphrey, who has taken Tricky, her pet dog, for a walk, and they are discussing over Tricky. I tried to sound severe. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Children, who says this? Mr. Herriot. He, when sees the situation, he was shocked. Which situation? Situation of Tricky. That he has become hugely obese. So, when he sees Tricky's situation, Tricky's physique, he is really shocked and worried. And thus, he tells Mrs. Pumphrey that she should cut his food right down and give him more exercises. That means she should plan his Tricky's diet. There should be a proper diet chart for Tricky, or else he will very soon he will become ill. And he also says you must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Why should she harden her heart? That is because Mrs. Pumphrey loves Tricky very much, and that is why she feels that he is malnourished. He is lacking nutrition, and thus she keeps on feeding him every now and then. And Tricky, because he is very greedy, he takes food any time of the day without thinking whether he is full-fledged or not. Now here Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Herriot. I am sure you are right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off, head down along the road, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. So, when Mr. Herriot tells Mrs. Pumphrey to harden her heart and put Tricky on a strict diet, she says, definitely I'll try to do this, Mr. Herriot. But then she also says that it is very difficult because she loves Tricky so much that she cannot skip Tricky's favorite chocolates and cakes, things like that Tricky loves. So she keeps on feeding. So at this she says it is very difficult for me to keep Tricky on diet. And then she sets off. That means she starts walking. She left that place, head down along the road, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. So when she left that place, she was looking down. Her head was down. She was looking on the road. When she was looking at the road, her head was down. This means that she was thinking very deeply. What was she thinking? She was determined very strongly this time, and she thought that she is going to put this regime, new regime. Now what is regime? A system or ordered way of doing things. So she was going to set this new goal into practice immediately. Her regime this time was to put Tricky on a diet. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. So when they both left, Mrs. Pumphrey and Tricky, when they left that place, Mr. Herriot was continuously looking at them, and he was very much concerned. So when they left that place, Mr. Herriot was watching them go and looking at Tricky, who was walking very unsteadily. Tottering means walking very unsteadily, right? Not in a proper way. He was not able to walk properly. And he also had a glance at what he was wearing. Tricky was wearing a tweed coat, that is a fur coat, woolen coat. And he also remembers these things that he doesn't have only this one coat. He has a full complete wardrobe of such tweed coats. And this was for winter weather, cold weather, in winter season, as well as he has a series of raincoat also for the monsoon season, for rainy days. So this tells us, these sentences tells us that Mrs. Pumphrey love her dog very much, and that she has taken complete care even of clothing the dog. So this was such a strong love of Mrs. Pumphrey for Tricky. So the expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting. Didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. So, here the narrator says, Mr. Harriot says that he uh, the narrator already knew that soon he would be receiving a call about Tricky, about falling ill, and it finally came. The call came after a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was very upset, as Tricky was not eating anything, not even his favorite dishes. What were his favorite dishes? Chocolates and cream cakes. So that is why Mrs. Pumphrey was very upset, as well as he was vomiting very frequently, and he did not even want to do anything. So he was just lying on the rug. Rug is carpet. So he was just lying on the carpet, panting. Panting is breathing very high, right? So as if very tired. And you have seen the word distraught here. Distraught means very worried and upset. And bouts of vomiting, bouts means a short period of intense activity. That means within a very short time intervals he was having continuously vomiting. So I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight, to be kept under observation. What is a fortnight? A period of 15 days. And many times it is said that a period of 2 weeks. So I had made my plans in advance. Who's I here? Here I refers to Mr. James Harriot, the veterinary surgeon. So he says that when he has got the call, he knew, he had already planned uh, his treatment in advance. What was that? The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. He knew that Tricky could be treated only when he could be taken out of that house for a certain period of time. So I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight, to be kept under observation, and thus he gave suggestion to Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky should be hospitalized. That is, he should be taken to hospital for about 15 days, so that he should be kept under observation, medical observation. The poor lady almost swooned. Swooned means fainted. So here Mrs. Pumphrey, when she heard about departing from Tricky, she almost fainted. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. She was also sure, here it means that she was sure that he would pine. Who is he? Tricky. He would pine. That is, Tricky would become thin and worried, and he may also die if he did not see Mrs. Pumphrey every day. That means here this highlights that both the dog and the mistress shared a very close bond, very strong bond, and they loved each other, and they cannot live. They may die if they have to live apart from each other, away from each other. But I took a firm line. Tricky was ill, and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay, and followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings, I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. So, but I took a firm line. That means it was a firm decision that Tricky has to be taken to hospital for 15 days, and thus only Tricky's illness can be cured. That was the only way to save his life. So what did he do? Mr. Harriot, he without any delay took Tricky in his hand, who was wrapped in a blanket, and he started marching towards his car, followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailing. So Mrs. Pumphrey was inside the house when she saw that Mr. Harriot was taking Tricky in his car. She started wailing. Wailing is crying with pain, grief, or anger. The entire staff was roused and maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Realizing that my car would never hold all the stuff, I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. So here, children, in this paragraph, the scenario which is highlighted is the whole house, along with Mrs. Pumphrey and the maids and the servants, they all are when departing from Tricky for around 15 days. They all are in grief and they want to give everything that he requires in his daily routine to Mr. Harriot, and thus they try to put everything in his car, but it was too much. So before they could fill his car completely with all such stuff, James Harriot started driving his car. But at the end of the street, when he was about to take the last turn of the street, he saw in his window mirror, the side mirror of the car, that everybody was crying. Everybody was in the tears. And how can we say that even the maids and the servants loved and took care of Tricky very much? We can see here that the entire staff was roused. So here we get to know that they cannot sleep. Roused means caused to stop sleeping, so sleepless. So the entire staff, they did not sleep, and maids rushed in and out bringing his day bed. So the maids are the female domestic servants. So the maids were also going inside the houses and bringing all the important things, his day bed, his night bed. So you can see here that his beds were also different. For resting during daytime, he had a day bed. For resting during night time, he has a night bed. And then they also took care of his favorite cushions, which cushion Tricky loved more, and the toys with which he used to play, his rubber rings with which he used to play. His breakfast bowl was different, lunch bowl was different, supper bowl was different. Supper means an evening meal, right? So typically light or informal one. So everything was different, and all such things they all tried to put it in the car so that it can be used there also at the hospital. Realizing this, that my car would never hold all the stuff, so James Harriot immediately realized that they are going to put all the requirements of Tricky into his car. So what did he do? He started to drive away, and then when he moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats through the window. So Mrs. Pumphrey also, when Mr. James Harriot started his car, she immediately an armful of, that means she had put lot of his favorite coats in her arm, so she immediately put it in the car through the window. And I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. So everybody was crying when he saw them last while taking the last turn of the street. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said, you haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. So, when they have left the street of Mrs. Pumphrey, now, when everything, all those emotional dramas were over, now Mr. James Harriot looked at the beside seats beside where Tricky was lying. So, he had a glance over the pathetic animal. Now, why he is feeling pathetic animal? He is feeling pity on him because he was really looking listless and tired, and he was gasping on the seat by my side. So he was looking at Mr. James Harriot, and when Mr. James Harriot patted means touch quickly and gently with the flat of the hand. So when children do good, so what do parents and elders do? They pat on the shoulder. In Hindi, it is called peet thap thapana. So when Mr. James Harriot patted uh, on the head of the Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. So at that, Tricky tried to wag his tail. Wagging is moving his tail to and fro. Right. So he tried. He made an effort, but he was not able to do it. So poor old lad, I said. So I said, James Harriot. He said to Tricky, poor old lad. That means this poor dog. You haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. So he says that you don't have any energy left in you, but he says that Miss James Harriot knew a cure for Tricky. That means he know how to make him active again. Thank you.